So, I've seen this kind of video done by a few different people, but I was inspired to film this one by Hayley from the channel Hayley in Bookland. I don't know if the idea originated with her or elsewhere. If you know, then let me know and let everybody else know. But I thought that it was a really fun idea, and although I read a lot of books that are very hyped here on booktube, I do also read a lot of books that I don't hear spoken about much, if at all, on booktube. So I thought I would try and hype up some of those books. So I'm going to take a hyped book and recommend a not so hyped book, starting off with Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, which is an epic fantasy trilogy that has a sort of heist theme and a very, very, very cool magic system, which is why I'm going to recommend that you pick up Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is also the start of an epic fantasy trilogy. Mistborn is currently 6 books. It will eventually be 10 or 13, I think. This is just going to be a trilogy, and it follows a character named Sanchia who has a particular kind of magic that allows her to touch objects and understand them. So for example, she could touch a brick wall and know where all the handholds are, and for that reason she is a very good thief. But unfortunately, at some point she steals the wrong thing and all hell breaks loose. The really cool magic system in this world is called scriving, and it involves writing on objects in the language of the scribes in order to persuade that object to behave in a certain way. So for example, you could persuade a plank of wood that actually it's a block of cement and therefore it is as strong as a block of cement, not as weak as a plank of wood. It's such an intricate and interesting magic system, and I really love the way that, as in Mistborn, it's not just you've got magic and you're excellent at it straight away. You really have to work at it for years and years and years to get really good at this magic system. Next, we're going on to a contemporary, so starting off with Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. If you liked this one, I think that you would love Starfish by Akemi Dawn Bowman. Both of these books follow characters who are struggling to decide what they want for their future after, in this case, secondary school in the UK, in this case, high school in the US. In this book, we follow a character named Kiko who desperately wants to go to an art school in New York called Prism, but unfortunately she doesn't get in, and at the same time that she doesn't get in, her abusive uncle moves back into the family home, and so she has to deal with the anxiety and depression that goes along with her life anyway and is amplified by the uncle's presence, but also what is she going to do now that her dream is no longer possible. The reason I'm comparing these two is because they're such emotional reads, both of them. They both deal with themes of anxiety and depression. This book also deals with eating disorders, and this book deals with suicide, so be aware of those trigger warnings. They're both very, very emotional and heartwarming in places stories, and they both have a very similar tone in my opinion, and I think if you did enjoy Radio Silence that you would enjoy Starfish as well. Next up, some slightly more light-hearted and paranormal fantasy. If you enjoyed City of Bones by Victoria Schwab, then I think that you would like the Mediator series by Meg Cabot. Now, I haven't been giving synopsis for the popular books because I think that the chances are you probably know what they're about already, but for this one I will, because the similarities are just hilarious. So in this book we follow a character named Cassidy Blake who can see and speak to ghosts, and her parents take her with them to Edinburgh because they're ghost hunters and they want to film a TV show hunting ghosts around the world and starting in Edinburgh because it's reportedly a very ghostly kind of city, and Cassidy has to deal with some ghost-related issues. In this book, we follow Susanna Simon, who can see and speak to ghosts, and she can also kick a little ghost butt if she needs to, and she has to move across the country to California where she finds a whole lot of ghosts that she has to deal with, and she has to help them move on into the afterlife or whatever happens next. So these two are very, very similar in plot, but they're also very similar in tone. I read this series when I was much younger and absolutely loved it, which made this book really nostalgic for me when I read it. I think this one's going to be a trilogy. This one had 6 books in it when I read them originally, but now I think that there are a couple more because the author returned to the world 5 years after the events, 5 or 10 years after the events of the final book, to show her audience where Sue's ended up, which I personally cannot wait to read because I loved these books so much when I was younger, and I think if you enjoyed this one, you really should give this one a go. Next up, a couple of books that aren't so similar, and you might be thinking to yourself, Sophia, why are you putting these 2 books together? They're completely different. So we have Orange by Ichigo Takano, and we have The Next Together by Lauren James. Orange is a contemporary manga with potentially some paranormal elements, and The Next Together is a sci-fi romance novel. So very, very different kinds of books, but here's the thing. They both are about love in one way or another. In this book, it's about love in a friendship sort of scenario, and in this one, it's a romantic sort of love. In this book, our protagonist gets a letter from her future self telling her to take certain steps, and in this one, we're following 2 characters falling in love throughout time again and again and again. And I just got a very similar warm and fuzzy feeling reading both of these. I felt an intense connection to the characters in both of these, and for that reason I highly recommend both of them, and I think that if you liked this one, that you would like this one. Next up we have The Wicked Fox, and I think that if you liked The Wicked Fox by Kat Cho, that you would like The Twisted Tree by Rachel Burge. Now, this book is sold as a YA fantasy with Korean-inspired folklore in it, but I actually, when I read it, felt that it was more like a contemporary romance, contemporary paranormal romance with Korean-inspired folklore in it. But either way, this book is paranormal horror fantasy. The reason I'm pairing these 2 together is because if you like books that deal with non-classic folklore inspirations, then these are both really good ones. Like I said, this one deals with Korean-inspired folklore, whereas this one deals with Norwegian-inspired folklore, and I found them both fascinating because I didn't really know anything about Korean or Norwegian folklore before going in. Other than that, they are quite different. They have very, very different tones, but if you like exploring new and different types of fantasy with inspirations from different kinds of mythology and folklore, then these are both really similar for that reason. And lastly, how could I not finish off with a couple more fantasy recommendations? The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon is arguably one of the most popular fantasy books of the year. It is female-led and it's multiple perspective and it has dragons in it and there's lots of politics and there are battles and there's female-female romance, which lots of people love, and it's standalone. So I'm not recommending a standalone, unfortunately, but I am recommending another female author, which is the Symphony of Ages series by Elizabeth Hayden. I'm going to put this down because my arm will drop off if I don't. This one's pretty chunky as well. This is an older fantasy series, and I said when I read this, it's marketed as standalone epic fantasy, but for me it felt more like high fantasy than epic fantasy, just because it was so much more focused on the characters than it was on the world building and the magic system. And I feel like in epic fantasy, world building and magic systems are a more prominent part, and I think that you'd have a hard time fitting all of that into a standalone. So I don't necessarily agree that it's epic fantasy, and I don't think that this is either, although it probably is also sold as epic fantasy. I think this is high fantasy too, because similarly it focuses a lot on its characters. So in this series, I don't want to tell you too much about it, because like a lot of high and epic fantasies, the less you know, the more you get out of it. But we do have a very strong female protagonist who has some very interesting relationships with those who are around her. We have, as in Priory, we have characters from different races, or I don't want to say species, but you know what I mean. There is magic, there is low-level world building. There is world building in this one, but like with Priory, it's not the priority. And if you have read Priory, then you know the role of the orange tree in that story, and there's similar tree involvement in this one. I'm not going to say any more than that because you really don't want to know it going in. But I never hear this series spoken about on booktube at all, and I try to promote it as much as possible. I read this one when I was a lot younger and I really loved the series. It's just so good. It's got a little bit more of a classic fantasy feel about it, even though it was only written in the late 90s, I believe, published in 1999. So it's not that old, it's 20 years old, but it feels a little bit more classic in tone, so do be aware of that. This is of course written in a much more modern kind of style, whereas this is sort of halfway between classic and modern fantasy. But I feel like if you enjoyed all the politics and the intricacies and the characters in Priory, that you would really enjoy The Symphony of Ages by Elizabeth Haydon, book 1 being Rhapsody. And that's it. Those are all of the I think you should read this if you liked this recommendations that I have for you today. If you do decide to pick any of these up, then please let me know, and let me know what you think of them. I'd be really interested. And if you have any other recommendations based on any of the books that I've mentioned, then let me know that too, because I of course loved every single book that I've mentioned. So if I can read more that's like them, then all the better. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks! Bye!